And now we are going to get to our main topic here on Mastering Dungeons. We are going to talk about exploring themes and genres in D&D and other role-playing games. So if you've been following the show, you know that we've been looking at other role-playing games and comparing them to D&D, showing the mechanics and the flavor and all of that. And what we've decided to do this week is, rather than dig into a specific game, we're going to talk in general about genre and theme, because we hear advocates of non-D&D role-playing games, whether they're just D&D haters or simply people who understand and appreciate different kinds of role-playing games, say things like, well, D&D or 5e isn't really that good at blank. You should really try this other game instead if you want to blank. And blank could be horror, blank could be storytelling, blank could be anything, any theme, any sort of play type, where people want to say that D&D doesn't do it as well, so you should try this other thing. So we want to sort of dig in and see, what does it mean when someone says that? What themes or what sorts of play styles are they talking about? And is it really true that D&D isn't that good at that? Or is it true? Or is it true in just certain cases? And so I have Ben here, master storyteller, to talk. Yes, you. To talk with us about this. So my first question, Ben, is, what do we mean by theme in terms of role-playing games?
I mean, that's a good question. And I wonder if you and I, just got looking at these show notes, if you and I are on a slightly different wavelength with this, because I think that theme in storytelling, in novels, in movies, in video games, especially modern games like God of War, theme is as opposed to genre. Not that those are opposing ideas, but just defining theme as separate from genre.
Mm-hmm.
And so, genre might be dark fantasy. Genre might be sci-fi. Genre might be high fantasy, heroic fantasy, cyberpunk. Those are the genre of a world that come with their tropes that you might want to play in. But each of those genres are good at exploring different themes.
Okay.
So dark fantasy tends to want to explore themes of struggle and sacrifice for victory, whereas heroic fantasy wants to explore themes of, is it better to be honorable than dishonorable? Honor usually wins out over dishonor in a heroic fantasy, as opposed to, historic fantasy or dark fantasy tends to focus much more on like the practicalities of life. Dishonor can in fact win over honor in the in certain circumstances. Does strength make right? Cyberpunk looks at the impact of advertising and the impact of technology on the human spirit, and I guess these are all kind of high-minded concepts that folks will talk about a lot in relation to books and movies predominantly, but I see a lot of this talk coming increasingly into video games, particularly through games like I mentioned, God of War, The Last of Us, these sort of storytelling games, even Cyberpunk, dare I mention its name, in the video game context. But are they important to role-playing games? Are they something that can be explored in role-playing games? Are they something that should be or shouldn't be explored in role-playing games? And what is the role of the GM in presenting these themes and the players in exploring these themes? Because you don't want to, as a GM, I think, be educational to your players. You don't want to be like, I'm going to teach them about this theme in a way that a book might try to do that. But that being said, I'm also an incredibly artsy person. So whenever I'm designing a campaign, I'm like, all right, what are the themes that I want to explore in this campaign? And what are the characters that I am going to create and the scenario that I'm going to create to explore this theme? Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it all makes sense. And it goes also to the mechanics of games,
Yeah.
because the mechanics of games tend to reinforce the themes that the game expects players to work within, both theme and genre. And so we'll just start with D&D. We'll start with 5e D&D because first edition D&D and fifth edition D&D and third edition they're all similar, but they all lead to a different sort of gameplay, especially something like first edition versus every from third edition on,
Mm.
because in third, fourth, and fifth edition, you are playing as a character, a superhero. It may not be a superhero in terms that we think of superheroes as Superman flying around or the Hulk smashing everything, but you are very powerful. And you are given those powers right from the start, from the birth of your character. And the game has hit points, which measure your life force, whether it's physical, mental, your will to go on, however you want to describe it. The
Mm.
game says that there will be conflict, and that conflict will be violent. And so the themes that naturally come forth out of a D&D game are going to be that sort of man versus creature, right? Man versus man. Those sorts of very basic conflicts that you see in stories. Now, can you go deeper? You absolutely can go deeper in terms of those themes. But at some point, the DM generally says, let's roll for initiative. And everything that's going on in the story around it tends to focus in on those die rolls.
Mm.
Can there be role playing within that? Absolutely. Does the game tend to encourage that? Not necessarily.
Sure.
The players and the game master have to bring that element to it, because the rules themselves don't say, well, if you are being brave and heroic, you get a bonus as opposed to being cowardly and craven. It's
Mm.
yeah, except if you're hiding behind cover or not, right? But even then, that's just the base rules. It's not something that story wise your character is making a choice that's going to affect the roles directly. I
Mm.
think. Does that
Yeah.
does that ring true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And I think that that's why a lot of folks, for 5e being the most popular role-playing game, certainly at the moment, a lot of folks try to do a lot of different things with it, myself included. And it can feel incongruous. You have that term used in video games a lot, that ludonarrative dissonance, when you might be trying to introduce a theme of what is monstrousness? Is
Mm-hmm.
monstrousness being a monster, or is monstrousness behaving in a way that could be described as monstrous? And you're trying to sort of explore this theme, but your players through the game are encouraged to skin and take out the teeth and carve out the heart of all the monsters that they slay, because that gives them a certain bonus in the game, which is not necessarily a 5e mechanic. It's actually a Grim Hollow mechanic. But it's the example that jumped into my mind in terms of like trying to explore a theme and then the mechanics just kind of crash into that theme.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're exploring monstrousness and one of the players is just like, well, I want the XP, so I'm gonna kill all these goblins, make sure every single one of them's dead. Because I get a bonus through the mechanics of the game for doing so.
Mm-hmm.
And so exploring theme definitely may require a tweak of the rules if you want to be able to not have those inconsistencies um between theme and mechanics. But what I'm curious about as someone who hasn't played a lot of other role-playing games is, are there games like I would just bandy a guess at something like Fate, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
that really does encourage the exploration of theme within the mechanics of that game?
Absolutely. And the mechanics themselves do that because they don't have hit points, say. They
Sure.
have a stress track. Now that stress track can represent physical damage. But that stress track could just as equally represent mental damage. That stress track could be used to represent wealth. That stress track could be changed to represent your ego. That stress track could be represent your romantic capabilities, your romantic prospects. And you could have a total romance game where the things that you try to do are, keep your romance track from running out, or to damage the romance track of suitors that are vying for the hand of your love. So, in that way, you can express those sorts of themes right in the mechanics of the game.
Sure. Are there, is theme, I suppose, something that you, when you're thinking of what role playing system you want to sit down and play, does theme play into it? And even more zoomed in than that, if you've decided as a group you're going to play 5e, does theme play into the decision around what adventure you're going to play or what adventure you're going to run? And I also just want to make a quick differentiation. Sorry, I have a habit of asking multi-layered questions. Um, Make that distinction between genre and theme. So if I'm deciding between Curse of Strahd or Rime of the Frost Maiden, which are both hypothetically horror adventures, I'm not necessarily choosing between the genre, even though there is slightly differentiations in genre there, but the theme of like, there's a romance to Curse of Strahd in a way. There's a gothic romance to Curse of Strahd versus the like winter survival of Rime of the Frost Maiden. How important is that to you in choosing the games that you're running or want to play in?
It should be important, but it ends up not being important for all the
Sure.
reasons we just talked about, which is unless there are mechanics that overcome or enhance that theme and present it in a different way, you're still sort of dealing with the same base system, the same game loops, the same reward system, all of those things. And games have tried, 5e D&D games have tried to introduce these new things via systems, new themes via systems. We've done it, with Grim Hollow. We're doing it. We did it with Aurora. We're doing it with the New Valakan Clans book. One of the things I love about Grim Hollow is the Beast Pool and the Resolve Pool, and
Mm.
that sort of tries to bring that theme you mentioned of monstrousness to the player characters in terms of the mechanics of the game, rather than being this ephemeral notion that's hanging over the game but not really interacting with the game.
Mm.
So if you act in a monstrous way in Grim Hollow and you're using the Beast Pool and Resolve Pool mechanics, every time you act in a monstrous way, the DM gets a Beast Pool die. If you act heroically, you get a Resolve die in your pool, which you can then use for various things. Even the transformations in Grim Hollow are trying to take that idea of monstrousness, mechanize it, and also give story beats that the game master can use to offset the powers that you get with some story and mechanical based elements that can be put in front of you as both story and mechanics, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I think the transformations do a good job of doing that. When I first looked at them, I remember discussing with the designers, these transformations seem really powerful. It seems like the player characters get a lot on top of what they're already getting from their species benefit and their class and any magic items that they might have. Why weren't these worked in as feats instead? Why weren't these worked in some sort of more balanced way? And the response that I got was initially the playtesting hated the idea of these being worked in as feats because they were taking the feat slot that somebody might want to take, or the ability score increase slot that somebody might want to take. But additionally, it's not really the point. yes, you become a lot more powerful through these transformations. You might become much more powerful than your fellow players at the table. But if your goal is not necessarily to play a game where you all slay monsters and eat some chips and have some fun, if your goal is to explore what is monstrousness and what is the experience of losing control of oneself,
Mhm.
these transformations are great because they make you a lot more powerful, but they also come with flaws
Mhm.
that your character has to grapple with. You know,
Mhm.
if you're a vampire, you have to roll saving throws to avoid attacking your fellow party members in your craving for blood. If you're playing an aberrant horror, you have to make rolls to avoid transforming different strange limbs. And how does that make you feel about your humanity? Sorry, we're going very highbrow in this episode. But yeah, you're right. They're excellent mechanics for kind of exploring those themes.
Yeah, and so that's the thing you need to look at when you talk about these themes, or if we want to say genres as part of the discussion,
Yeah, yeah,
not
sure,
necessarily
sure.
equal, but uh, yeah, how do the mechanics handle that? And so that's why when people say, well, I'm playing D&D, I love horror, so I'm playing horror games with 5e, and everyone steps forward and says, why aren't you playing Call of Cthulhu? Why aren't you playing Dread? Why aren't you playing this? Why aren't you playing that? And it's not a stupid question. It sometimes comes off as a little snotty
Yeah,
because the reason people play 5e is because people play 5e
yeah.
and people know 5e. So, to have someone take a game and make some adjustments to it rather than playing this other game doesn't mean that they're putting down the other game. They just are working with the form that they know the best and have the best chance of altering in a way that fits what exactly they want.
Yeah, absolutely.
But speaking of horror, I think horror, and I'm not talking about like grim fantasy or dark fantasy.
Sure.
I'm talking about true horror. One of the things where, but I know I've talked about it with you before, is that D&D is not a great game for horror for reasons of theme. The themes that the genre brings forth are this dark hopelessness, this nihilism, right? This idea that
Mm,
no matter what you try, no matter where you turn, you're done. Something's coming
mm,
for you. And you can think you're smart, but you're not. You can think you're fast, but you're not. Because
mm.
no matter how fast you run, this monster that can only move like 3 steps, every 10 seconds is still somehow right behind you.
Mm.
And D&D is not good at that sort of thing. Would you
Yeah.
agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It was fascinating watching this get kind of discovered across a number of years in the video game industry, where Dead Space came out. It was this video game from like, I want to say 2008, 2009, maybe. And it was billed as like the most horrifying video game, the most terrifying video game that had ever existed. And I played the first 10 minutes of it, and it's kind of a mix of Alien and The Thing into one conglomerate of terror. And I played the first 10 minutes and I was like, nah, I'm hard out. Like, I do not want to play that anymore because I don't do well with horror, ironically. But then the second two games that came out in that series and in other video game horror series, I think what they were trying to do was capture the idea of fun because video games are meant to be fun. But what they found is as these games became more and more action based, more and more heroic, if you will, even though they've got scary monsters with bits falling off them and horrible imagery and body horror, they're not scary because you can deal with the thing that's coming after you. You have the tools to be able to fight back against the monster. And so if you can defeat the monster, then its power as as something to be feared is taken away. And then games like I'm gonna completely blank on its name. The sequel had a subtitle called Machine for Pigs, I think. But Amnesia, The Dark Descent, was the name of the video game. And Slender Man came out, which was a very simple little game. And all these games did was just make it so that you could not fight back. The only way you could avoid getting torn apart or eaten or whatever happened was to go and hide or outrun the monster or something like that. And suddenly the game becomes so much more terrifying. And there was this almost rebirth of video game, of horror in the video game sphere. Um, I'm sure that story can be told a lot more with a lot more nuance by a video game historian or aficionado. But it was interesting coming into 5e, wanting to play not necessarily horror, but definitely wanting to play dark fantasy and finding it very hard to do because 5e naturally leans into that heroic fantasy. You can fight back. You have all the tools, no matter how powerful, especially once the player characters start hitting level 6, 7, 8, unless you're throwing something at them that's well beyond their capabilities to fight, they're probably going to be able to defeat it handily.
Yeah.
And so that's why it doesn't work well in that genre.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened role playing game wise when Ravenloft first came out.
Right.
Not the initial adventure, but the box set world. And I was so excited. I bought that box set, and I thought my game group was going to love this. And we started playing, and they just didn't. And I tried to do things that simulated that sort of loss of control, loss of complete understanding of everything going on in the world, right?
Mm.
I'm going to keep track of your hit points. You don't know how many hit points you have. You know you're injured, but you're not sure how injured. Oh, they hated
Sure.
that. They hated that loss of control. And these are people I would consider fans of horror, but they didn't want that in their game because D&D wasn't horror to them, even though they tried to make it horror and wanted it to be horror. They really didn't want it to be horror. They wanted it to be D&D.
Well, I wonder if there's something in that as well, because like to bring this back to a discussion about theme, horror is about hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
Horror is about fear, and the unknown. Or even if you know something, your end is
Mm-hmm.
upon you. Of existential dread, of feeling
Right.
small in a very big kind of galaxy or world or whatever it is. Um, and taking away someone's hit points may have made them feel like they didn't have the steering wheel on their car anymore, but it's just a feel bad moment. It's not
Mm-hmm.
it's I don't feel hopeless. I don't feel like the monster's overwhelming. I just feel like I'm blind
Mm-hmm.
now. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Right.
So I think that's very interesting to kind of play with, like, what can you take out? No, that's not capturing the actual theme. That's just
Mm-hmm.
trying to mechanically manipulate the situation. All right, let's put that back in. Let's see if I take away this, or let's see if I change that, or let's see if I change this modifier. There's a lot that can be played with there to try get the specific feeling of theme that a simple mechanic change on its own might not be able to accomplish. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even further, like right at the base core of D&D is characters aren't meant to die.
Sure, yeah.
And show me a horror movie where no one dies. Yeah, that's probably not the unless you're like you're into the very cerebral, like The Witch or Heredity. Those
Yes.
sorts of
Yeah.
movies that are very psychological. But again, that's you're not going to have a D&D game where everyone's sitting around a table, having dinner and discussing weird topics or having weird small tricky things happening. It's just not, but there are games for that.
Hmm. What my vocabulary is not big enough. So I know by reputation things like Call of Cthulhu.
Right.
I know by reputation, Dread. I think I have played Dread once. What are some games that are really good at capturing different themes, in the horror genre and beyond?
Yeah, I don't know. Other than the ones we've mentioned, I'm not as familiar with horror
Sure.
as I possibly could be. But we could carry this into other genres and other themes. We can talk about apocalyptic games and
Sure.
what are the themes that come with those sorts of things, the survival, the exploration, those sorts of games. And again, D&D doesn't do those well. And so you either need to add on some mechanics to make it so that you feel the importance and the conflict and the drama of exploration and survival, or you need to go to a completely different and do more of a sci-fi apocalyptic game
Sure.
rather than D&D, where you can cut down the power level of the characters to the point where they can't at second level or third level cast create water, or
Mm.
purify food and drink, or something that just allows them to survive with a simple spell.
But how do you do that without it just feeling like busy work? Because I like when I think post-apocalypse, again, leaning back into the video game realm, I think instantly of Fallout.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a role-playing game for Fallout now as well, which maybe
Mm-hmm.
I should look into. And what the theme that I think of about Fallout really strongly stands out to me is loneliness,
Mm-hmm.
because that expanse of the wasteland, whichever wasteland you're in, I've played a lot of Fallout games, you're just walking through this wasteland. It's
Mm-hmm.
rocky and there's dead trees and there's maybe a house and there's, monsters around maybe, and you deal with them, but you move on. The It's not the threat of like getting killed in the wasteland for me in Fallout. It's just the intense loneliness you feel just wandering around that place between the moments where you discover something,
Mm-hmm.
And that I think would be very hard to capture in a role playing game, because you're with people inherently when you play role playing games. Most of the time, if you're playing a
Yeah.
tabletop role playing game, unless it's a solo one. So it would be interesting, but sorry, within that same thought, I remember there was a survival mode, I think, for Fallout New Vegas, where it was like you've got to worry about your water, and you've got to make
Mm-hmm.
sure you drink enough, and you've got to make sure you sleep enough. And I think Skyrim introduced the same thing, where you can't be out in the cold too long and
Mm-hmm.
you need to be near fire and blah blah blah. And I was like, this is great, this is like introducing survival, and this is going to be awesome, and I'm going to feel like I'm really surviving. And it just, again, felt bad, because all it felt like was busy work, and I turned it
Yeah.
off within like 2 hours of playing. I was like, I can't be bothered standing next to this fire for the next like 20 minutes. Like,
Yeah.
I got stuff to do.
And although the theme and the genre are different, it's the same problem as horror, right? It's the same
Yeah.
thing of not having the power to make your situation better. And
Mm.
so, with D&D, we've we've added systems to our games in Grim Hollow and in Aurora to be able to sort of keep a meter for how well you are doing at the survival and the exploration. And the goals of the games have to change a bit, right? It can't be just go out, kill everything, take all its treasure. It's making choices to do one thing or another, and being ready to suffer the consequences if you go off and do this one thing and not take care of the more basic needs of yourself, your party, or a settlement that you are trying to build.
Mm.
I'm working on an adventure right now that delves into that, exactly that thing of, we have this settlement here. What are we going to focus our energy doing? Are we going to go out and make ourselves more powerful? Or are we going to do what we need to do to make the settlement more powerful, giving us a safe space to be in as we become more powerful?
Mm.
So, it's those choices that you can represent in D&D if you add some rules, but other games might do it a little better, as your personal power is tied to theme, as is tied to aspects outside of you.
Mm.
So there's a game that a group that I work with sometimes called Encoded Designs is been toying with, where you I don't know if I should talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it. But
That's okay.
let's put it this way: your community is just as important as your character,
Yeah.
and so you can have several goals and several stories, and the things you do for your community may take away from your personal power, but you get that power in other ways, in other story ways, and in other mechanical ways. Because if
Mm,
your community is wiped out, you're just as screwed as if you had been wiped out. So
mm,
you can't just take one track and put all your energy toward your own character. You need to put some toward this other thing. And you can do it with Powered by the Apocalypse games. And you can do it with fate-based games. Because with a fate-based game, your community might be an aspect. And that aspect
right.
is something that if your community's strong, you can use a fate point to get power from that community. If your community is weak, the game master can use that aspect against you to make your life miserable. So
Mm,
it's it's those sort of more storytelling focused games can handle it a bit better.
mm.
Any other thoughts on theme?
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the one other thing is like there's the other aspect to role playing games, which is the more nebulous aspect, which is the storytelling aspect, is sort of separated from the mechanics. And that feel good moment is when the mechanics feel like the story that's being told. I think Monty Martin of the Dungeon Dudes talked about this a while ago in the Lorecast, where wielding two weapons, one in each hand, you feel like you need to roll two separate attacks, or you feel like you need to roll two separate dice. It's not enough to just do more damage on one attack, because that feels like you're just attacking with one weapon. But there's also the storytelling aspect is kind of an important partnership for me in creating theme. A big theme of my recent Grim Hollow campaign has been kind of like the power of authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've introduced the faction, the Arcanist Inquisition, who are a very well-known faction in Grim Hollow, who hunt down mages. They're like the Children of the Light, I think they're called, in the Wheel of Time, or the Templars in Dragon Age, if you're familiar with either, or the Witch Hunters in The Witcher,
Mm-hmm.
separate from Witchers themselves. And so having these characters present in the story, and they have, they do have mechanics. Their stat blocks have mechanics which make them proficient at hunting mages, and you can give them magic items, perhaps ironically, divine magic items that make them more proficient at hunting mages. And more than that, they can like rabble rouse a community, because they one of their big weapons is faith. They don't need to travel with armies. They can raise an army wherever they go, because they get the community to be like, yes, we love the gods. The gods are telling us that we must hunt down mages. And so the community can turn against spellcasters as well. And what I found was really interesting with introducing this big story element was that magic had never felt more dangerous in my campaign than in a campaign where magic was functionally illegal,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which forced the player characters to play the game in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And we agreed early on, if you cast a spell, it is very obvious. You can't, unless you have subtle spell, which is a very specific sorcerer ability, people know when you cast magic.
Mm-hmm.
And so that story element really played into the themes and the way the players interacted with the campaign in a surprisingly big way, to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
compared to previous games that I've played, where I've been like, yeah, magic is like frowned upon, and players like, yeah, whatever, speak with dead. You know what I mean?
Right, right. And so you're illuminating one of the big hard hard things to reconcile in role playing games, which is the rules versus the story. And you
Sure.
want the story to inform the rules and the rules to inform the story. And when you, like you said, when you do that, it's great. But it's very, very hard to do that. And sometimes you need to introduce very subtle, or sometimes not very subtle, systems so that the players can mechanize what the story is moving toward. So for your example of casting a spell will draw the attention of the authorities, you can role play it, but unless the players have a way of understanding what the consequences of their actions will be and are once they do it, it
Mm.
becomes a trap. It becomes hard to do because a player might think, well, I'm alone now, so I can do this. And they do it, and you say, well, you did it, but you were within the city limits. So even though you didn't think you were being watched, you were being watched.
Sure,
And it
sure.
becomes a very situational thing, which can be handled through a lot of communication, but sometimes that communication can slow the game down to almost a standstill because you're
Yeah.
always saying, okay, can I cast now? What's going on around me? So what you can do is mechanize it in some way to say every time you use magic, no matter where you are, this counter goes up one.
Mm.
And if that counter gets to 10, hellfire is going to rain down upon you in the story. So be ready
Yeah.
for that. And it it adds a mechanic, but it adds a mechanic that lets everybody know where everything stands.
Yeah.
And so when you can put that into a system, again, subtly is best, but sometimes it has to be unsubtle, like that counter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can even make it a little more mysterious in that I just rolled a four-sided die. So you're safe up to 5. You might be safe up to 9, but anywhere from 6 to 9 might be in trouble. So that
Hmm.
adds a little mystery. It gives the play, things like that can help players understand in a mechanical way what the story is going to turn into if they
Mm.
do a thing that the story would have them uh, be wary of doing.
Yeah. Yeah. You've already given me a whole bunch of ideas in terms of like creating zones,
Mm-hmm.
high danger, mid danger, safe. And it's like if you're in a safe zone, you can cast magic without problems. If
Mm-hmm.
you're in a mid danger, maybe a counter goes up. If you're in a high danger, you might immediately suffer the consequences of somebody sort of witnessing that.
Mm-hmm.
Grim Hollow also, as you've already mentioned, has the beast pool and the resolve pool, which could perhaps be used in this way as described in the I think it's the player's guide therein. It sort of says, this is tied to thematically the great beast of the Burak Empire that kind of wanders around. And if the beast pool ever reaches 6, then the beast itself shows up and there's kind of a cataclysm that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I like tying that, and I think the rules even say this, you can tie that to kind of any major threat. If they're adventuring in Astoya, you might tie that to the Crimson Court, and a
Mm-hmm.
court member shows up if that ever gets to 6. I like the idea of doing it in Castanella with the Inquisition, and it's like,
Right.
yeah, if that every time you cast magic, it's a beast dice, and if that
Mm-hmm.
reaches 6, like a new Inquisition is launched. A
Yep.
grand army marches out from Tolatum or something. So that's
Yeah.
cool. I enjoy that.
Yeah. So I hope that people have enjoyed our little talk on theme here. I hope it's resounded in people's minds. And as we go forward, as Teos and I move forward and look at other games, we'll come back to
Mm.
this discussion to talk about themes and genres and how they work in these different games. If they work well, if they're sort of kludgy or somewhere in between. So thank you, Ben, for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
All right. And I want to thank all our listeners and our patrons as well. If you would like to become a patron of the show, you can do so. You can be a Master of Dungeons, and we thank you for doing that. You can be a Master of Realms. And if you are a Master of the Realms, then you get to be in our show notes. So thank you. And if you are a Master of the Multiverse, well, you get your name read on the air. So thank you, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Robin Dermy, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Shawn Hurst, Brian King, Travis Lee, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Eric Mengi, The Micro Ant, Sean Malley, Falcon Neal, Chance Russo, Krishna, Simone Say Can You See by the Dawn's Early Light, Joe Tyler, Mateus Valero at Twin Portals, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you, listeners. You can come and be a patron at patreon.com/masteringdnd. Ben, where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, you can find me on the Ghostfire Gaming YouTube channel where I'm throwing out videos each week, kind of trying to craft darker fantasy stories in 5e. And of course, you can find the both of us, Shawn, each week on the Eldritch Lorecast, which is our weekly podcast that is hosted by myself, yourself, James Hake, and Dale Kingsmill, which you can find where all good podcasts can be found, likely wherever Mastering Dungeons can be found in this very app that you're listening to.
It's true. And you can find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin. You can find Mastering Dungeons at MasteringDND on Twitter. We're also on Mastodon. You can join us on Patreon, or you can find us at the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. So, Ben, we have talked about theme and genre and what it brings to games. So what are we going to do now?
We're going to go hunt some monsters.
And take their brains and eat them.
Make a stew.
Because that's the kind of folks we are.
Yummy.